Hell's Angel leader, secretly returns home. What he saw on his sister's face changed everything. A former biker leader sneaks back into his hometown under the cover of night, ready to protect the only family he has left, his sister. But the moment she opens the door, everything inside him shatters, because the woman standing there looks exactly like her, talks like her, even remembers things only family should know. But there's one tiny detail missing, something no imposter should ever be able to get wrong. And when this strange woman leans in and whispers, "If you want her alive, don't ask questions," the world he thought he knew collapses. Suddenly, he's pulled into a dangerous game of lies, hidden enemies, and a truth so twisted it could destroy both of them. Now he has to figure out the one thing no brother ever wants to ask himself. If this isn't his sister, then where is the real one? And why is someone trying so hard to erase her? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The rumble of Jagger Holt's motorcycle softened to a purr as he eased off the throttle, rolling into the familiar curves of Highway 24, just as the Colorado sun began its descent behind the mountains. The fading golden light painted long shadows across the asphalt, stretching like dark fingers reaching toward his hometown of Fairdale. Each mile marker brought a tightening in his chest, memories he'd spent more than 10 years trying to outrun catching up with him at last. He hadn't planned on coming back. Not ever. But the urgent message from his old club contact had changed everything. "They're going after Emily. Your sister needs you, brother." Those words had sent him racing across 3 states, the weight of his promise to protect Emily heavy on his shoulders. The same promise he'd made to their mother on her deathbed, back when Emily was just a kid with scraped knees and untamed pigtails. The town hadn't changed much. The same weathered storefronts lined Main Street, though some names had changed. Johnson's Hardware was now Miller's. The old movie theater still had its Art Deco marquee, but the letters were more faded than he remembered. Everything felt smaller somehow, like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. Jagger guided his bike behind the abandoned feed store, choosing the spot carefully. The building's hollow windows stared at him like empty eye sockets as he cut the engine. The silence that followed felt oppressive, broken only by the ticking of his cooling engine and the distant bark of someone's dog. He took off his helmet and ran a hand through his graying hair, feeling every one of his 38 years. The leather of his jacket creaked as he dismounted, his boots crunching on scattered gravel. The air smelled of late summer, dust and dry grass, with hints of someone's backyard barbecue carrying on the evening breeze. Taking a moment to steady himself, Jagger leaned against his bike. The metal was still warm against his palm, offering a strange comfort. He'd changed in the years since he'd left, traded in his club colors for honest work, left behind the violence that had once defined him. But standing here, in the growing shadows of his hometown, he felt that old life pressing in around him like a too-tight jacket. Emily's rental house was 3 blocks away. He'd memorized the address from the single Christmas card she'd managed to send him 2 years ago, before he'd had to move on again. As he walked the quiet streets, each step stirred up memories like dust devils. Emily at age 8, racing her bicycle down Cedar Street with streamers flying. Emily at 12, reading under the big maple tree in the park, her laughter echoing through their childhood home, bright and clean as mountain spring water. The neighborhood was peaceful at this hour. Porch lights were starting to flicker on, and through windows he caught glimpses of families settling in for the evening. Normal lives. Safe lives. The kind of life he'd always wanted for Emily. Her house was a small craftsman with white trim and blue shutters. Flowers spilled from window boxes, and a welcome mat with faded sunflowers lay before the front door. Through the window, a lamp cast a warm glow that made the house look like something from a painting, cozy, inviting, everything his life wasn't. Jagger's boots felt heavy as lead as he climbed the 3 wooden steps to her porch. The boards creaked beneath his weight, and he noticed absently that they needed fixing. His heart hammered against his ribs as he raised his fist to knock, then hesitated. What right did he have to come back into her life, to bring his darkness to her doorstep? Before he could retreat, the door opened. Emily stood there, backlit by the warm light from inside, and for a moment Jagger couldn't breathe. She looked so much like their mother, the same gentle eyes, the same way of holding herself. Her hand flew to her mouth as recognition dawned on her face. "Jagger?" Her voice trembled. "Oh my God, Jagger!" She threw herself into his arms, and he caught her automatically, muscle memory from all those times he'd swung her up when she was little. The scent of her shampoo, something floral and sweet, wrapped around him like a blanket. For one perfect moment, he felt like he'd finally come home. Then the porch light flickered on, harsh and revealing, and everything changed. Jagger's entire body went rigid. His arms, which had been holding his sister close, turned to stone. His eyes fixed on her cheek, searching for something that should have been there but wasn't. The tiny crescent scar, the one Emily had gotten when she was 6 years old, falling from the apple tree in their backyard, was missing. The warmth that had been building in his chest turned to ice. This woman in his arms, with Emily's voice, and Emily's eyes and Emily's smile, wasn't his sister at all. And suddenly, the warning that had brought him racing back to Fairdale took on a whole new meaning. The threat wasn't just coming. It was already here. Jagger's fingers tensed against the woman's shoulders as he pulled back, keeping his movements casual despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. His eyes swept over her features, cataloging every detail while maintaining a brother's warm smile. She looked exactly like Emily. The same honey-brown hair, the same slight tilt to her chin when she smiled. Too exact, like someone had studied photographs. "Let me make us some tea," she said, her voice carrying that familiar lilt that had always reminded him of their mother. "You must be exhausted from the road." He followed her into the kitchen, his boots silent on the linoleum floor. The space was pure Emily, herb plants on the windowsill, the collection of mismatched teacups their grandmother had started. The woman moved through it all with practiced ease, filling the electric kettle and reaching for the cabinet where Emily always kept her favorite chamomile blend. She hummed softly as she worked, and Jagger's throat tightened. It was the tune he used to play on their father's old guitar, the one Emily had always begged him to sing when thunderstorms kept her awake. Each note felt calculated, a performance meant to put him at ease. The kettle clicked off, and steam rose as she poured water over the tea bags. Her movements were smooth, rehearsed, like an actor who had studied their role extensively but couldn't quite capture the small, unconscious gestures that made a person real. She turned, catching his scrutiny, and something flickered behind her eyes. Without a word, she moved to the windows, drawing the blinds with deliberate care. The soft click of each slat falling into place seemed to echo in the suddenly tense kitchen. "Don't," she whispered, raising a finger to her lips as she returned to the counter. "Whatever questions you're about to ask, don't. The house is being watched." Her voice was barely audible over the gentle clink of spoons against ceramic as she prepared their cups. Jagger's muscles coiled tight, years of survival instincts screaming at him to move, to act. But he forced himself to remain still, accepting the steaming cup she offered with steady hands. "Sit," she murmured, gesturing to the small kitchen table. Please. He lowered himself into one of the wooden chairs, positioning himself to keep both the window and the door in his peripheral vision. The woman, this echo of his sister, sat across from him, her fingers wrapped around her own cup. I knew you would come, she said softly. Emily told me you would, weeks ago. She said when things went wrong, you'd feel it somehow. That you'd come home. The tea steamed between them, untouched. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sliding across the drawn blinds like searching fingers. She reached into her pocket, movements slow and deliberate, and withdrew an envelope. The paper was slightly crumpled, as if it had been carried close for some time. Jagger recognized the handwriting immediately, the way Emily always made her Y's with a little curl, how she crossed her T's with a slight upward slant. She wanted you to have this, the woman said, sliding it across the table. It explains some of what happened, what she discovered at the pharmaceutical company. Jagger picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He could smell Emily's perfume on the paper, the same vanilla scent she'd worn since high school. His chest ached with the reality of what this letter meant. Emily had known she was in danger, had prepared for it. The night pressed closer around them, shadows deepening in the corners of the kitchen. Their tea grew cold, forgotten, as Jagger stared at the envelope that held his sister's words. The woman watched him with Emily's eyes, but behind them was something else. Urgency, fear, determination. She leaned forward suddenly, her voice dropping even lower. If you want Emily alive, you have to trust me, starting now. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and threat, as Jagger held her gaze across the kitchen table. His sister's face, but not his sister's eyes, waited for his response in the growing darkness. The morning sun crept through Emily's living room curtains, painting stripes across Jagger's face as he lay on the worn leather couch. He hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time, his mind racing with questions and possibilities. The blanket the imposter had given him still carried Emily's familiar laundry detergent scent, making his heart ache with each breath. He heard movement in the kitchen, quiet footsteps, the soft clink of a coffee mug. Pushing himself up, Jagger ran a hand over his stubbled jaw and steeled himself for the confrontation ahead. He couldn't wait any longer. The woman who wasn't Emily stood at the counter, spooning sugar into her coffee exactly the way his sister always had. 2 level scoops, never heaping. The detail made his jaw clench. Who are you? His voice came out rough, demanding. Really? She set the spoon down carefully, then turned to face him. Gone was the pretense of being Emily. Her shoulders dropped, her stance shifted, and suddenly she was someone else entirely. Grace Whitaker, she said quietly. I worked with Emily at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. She gestured to the coffee pot. Would you like some while we talk? Jagger shook his head, remaining standing. The scar. Why couldn't you fake that? Grace's fingers absently touched her own cheek where Emily's crescent scar should have been. Makeup would have been noticed. These people, they're thorough. They study every detail. A sudden scar appearing would have drawn attention we couldn't afford. What people? Jagger took a step, closer, using his height to loom over her. To her credit, she didn't flinch. The same ones who made Emily disappear. Grace set her coffee down, untouched. She found something, Jagger. Something they'd kill to keep quiet. She moved to the kitchen table where a laptop bag sat. From it, she pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. Emily was working on clinical trials for a new anti-anxiety medication. The initial results weren't good, severe side effects, dangerous complications. But the company buried those results, falsified new ones. Jagger picked up the folder, scanning through pages of chemical formulas and medical jargon he couldn't understand. But he recognized Emily's neat handwriting in the margins, her methodical documentation. She was going to go public, Grace continued. She had everything ready: the original data, internal emails, proof of the cover-up. But the night before she planned to meet with a journalist? Grace's voice caught. She vanished. Her apartment was ransacked, her computer stolen. And you just happened to be there to step into her life? Skepticism edged Jagger's words. Grace's eyes flashed with something like guilt. I helped her gather the evidence. I was part of the data analysis team. I saw what they were hiding too. Emily trusted me. She reached back into the bag and pulled out a charred piece of plastic and metal. This is what's left of her backup drive. I found it in her storage unit after someone broke in and tried to burn everything. Jagger took the melted flash drive, turning it over in his hands. The sight of it made the danger feel suddenly more real, more immediate. Corporate kill team? Grace nodded grimly. Meridian has a special security division, ex-military mostly. They handle their problems quietly. She wrapped her arms around herself. Emily knew they'd come for her eventually. She made me memorize her daily routines, her habits. Said if anything happened to her, someone needed to maintain her normal patterns while we figured out where they took her. We? Jagger's voice was sharp. She said you'd come home if she disappeared. Grace met his eyes steadily. She said you'd know, somehow, that you'd feel it. The truth of it hit him hard. Even after all these years running, that connection with Emily had never faded. He'd felt it like a physical pull when his old contact had warned him about the threat to her life. They stood in tense silence for several moments before Grace suddenly straightened, checking her watch. We need to pack. Now. What? She was already moving through the house, pulling a small duffel bag from a closet. Your arrival will have triggered their surveillance protocols. They monitor everything. Traffic cameras, cell phones, credit card activity. The longer we stay, the more danger we're in. Jagger watched her efficiently gather essentials, clothes, toiletries, a first aid kit. Her movements were practiced, like she'd rehearsed this, too. You really think they're watching? Grace paused, one hand on the zipper of the now full bag. I know they are. We need to leave before... A noise from the backyard made them both freeze. Grace moved to the kitchen window, carefully peering out. Her face paled. What is it? Jagger joined her, following her gaze to the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. There, cutting through the pristine white surface, were several sets of deep boot prints. They circled the house, stopping directly under the window where they stood. They were here, Grace whispered, while we slept. Her hands trembled slightly as she zipped the bag closed. We're out of time. The boot prints stood as silent testimony to their vulnerability, the snow preserving the evidence of their watchers in perfect detail. Jagger studied the precise, military-style tread pattern and knew these weren't amateur threats. These were professionals who wanted them to know they were being watched. The morning sun continued to climb, casting long shadows across the unmarred snow between the threatening footprints. In the distance, a car engine started, then faded away, leaving them in a silence that felt anything but empty. The old pickup truck groaned as Jagger turned the key, rust flaking from its undercarriage as the engine sputtered to life. Grace tossed their bags behind the seat and climbed in, her movements quick and precise. Dark clouds rolled across the morning sky, matching the heavy tension in the air. As they pulled away from Emily's rental house, Jagger kept checking the rear-view mirror, watching the familiar streets of his hometown shrink behind them. The boot prints in the snow had shaken them both more than they wanted to admit. "Head north on Highway 24, Grace directed, her voice steady despite her pale complexion. "We need to get into the mountains." Jagger guided the truck onto the main road, letting the rhythmic thrum of tires on pavement fill the uneasy silence. After several miles, he spoke. "Tell me where we're going." Grace pulled a wrinkled map from her jacket pocket, smoothing it against her thighs. "There's a small community up in the mountains, barely more than a dozen homes scattered through the forest. Emily found shelter there with a widow named Mrs. Geneva Davenport." Her fingers traced the route as she spoke. "It's remote enough that outsiders stand out, but close enough to civilization that Emily could still gather information." Jagger studied Grace from the corner of his eye as she spoke. The morning light caught the shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she refolded the map. Was this all an elaborate act? Or was she truly haunted by her role in everything? Mrs. Davenport, he tested the name. How did Emily find her? "Church connection," Grace replied. Emily had been attending services in town before everything happened. Mrs. Davenport was visiting her granddaughter there. When Emily needed help, she remembered the kind widow who'd talked about her quiet mountain home. A semi-truck roared past them, and Grace flinched at the sound. Her shoulders remained tense long after it passed. "I should have done more," she whispered, almost to herself. "When I first saw the altered data, I should have spoken up with her. Maybe if we'd gone public together." The guilt in her voice felt too raw to be manufactured. Jagger had known enough liars in his past life to recognize genuine remorse when he heard it. Thunder rumbled overhead as they wound their way into higher elevation. The old truck's heater barely kept pace with the dropping temperature, and Grace rubbed her arms for warmth. "Need to stop soon," Jagger announced as they passed a sign advertising a diner 5 miles ahead. "Check the gas, stretch our legs." Grace nodded. "We should eat something too, but we'll need to be quick." The diner appeared around a bend, its neon "open" sign buzzing in the gray afternoon light. Only 3 other vehicles sat in the gravel parking lot: an ancient station wagon, a delivery van, and a mud-splattered pickup, much like Jagger's. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and grilled onions. A tired-looking waitress pointed them toward a booth by the window. Jagger positioned himself to see both the entrance and the kitchen door, old habits dying hard. While they waited for their food, Grace pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Checking for any suspicious apps or location services," she explained quietly. "They're good at hiding their tracking software." Jagger watched a trucker at the counter drain his coffee cup, catalog the elderly couple sharing pie near the door, note the cook's movements visible through the kitchen window. Every stranger was a potential threat now. Their food arrived, hamburgers and fries that neither of them had much appetite for. They ate quickly, speaking little. Grace insisted on paying with cash, leaving no electronic trail. Back on the road, the mountains loomed closer. The pavement eventually gave way to gravel, then to a rutted dirt road that switched back and forth up the forested slope. The old truck labored against the incline as afternoon shadows lengthened between the trees. "There," Grace pointed to a wooden mailbox nearly hidden by overgrown bushes. "Turn here." The driveway curved through thick pines before opening to reveal a cabin that seemed to grow straight from the mountainside. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, and carefully tended flowers brightened the wooden porch, despite the late season. They parked beside a neatly stacked woodpile. Before they could reach the front steps, the cabin's door opened. A woman in her 70s stood in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Grace." she said softly, recognition and worry mixing in her tone. Then her gaze shifted to Jagger, and something in her expression crumpled. She pressed one hand against the doorframe as if needing its support. "You must be Emily's brother," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She prayed you'd come." Mrs. Davenport's next words fell like stones into the mountain silence. "Before they took her." The old woman's words hung in the chill air, confirming their worst fears. Behind them, thunder growled across the darkening sky, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Inside Mrs. Davenport's cabin, warmth wrapped around them like a protective blanket. The scent of pine from fresh-cut logs mingled with wood smoke from the River Rock fireplace. Jagger's muscles began to unknot slightly in the cozy space, though his eyes continued scanning every corner, every window, every possible point of entry. "Please sit," Mrs. Davenport gestured to the well-worn furniture arranged around the hearth. Her movements were deliberate and graceful as she settled into a rocking chair, its familiar creaking a counterpoint to the crackling fire. "I've been hoping someone would come for Emily's things, praying it would be family." Grace perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jagger remained standing, his back to the warm stones of the fireplace. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. Mrs. Davenport nodded, her weathered hands smoothing her skirt. "Emily stayed with me for 3 weeks. Sweet girl, but so frightened. She helped me in the garden, made bread with me, tried to keep busy, but her eyes were always watching the road." The older woman's voice caught. Then one night, about 2 weeks ago, she saw something that spooked her badly. "What did she see?" Jagger pressed. "2 vehicles she didn't recognize, moving slow along the access road. No headlights. She was out on the porch when she spotted them, came running inside, white as a sheet." Mrs. Davenport's rocking picked up speed slightly. She grabbed her emergency bag, she always kept one packed, and headed out the back door into the woods, told me not to worry, that she had a plan. The old woman's eyes grew distant. "It was snowing that night. I watched her disappear into those trees, and my heart just broke." Grace made a small, pained sound. "Did she say anything about where she might go?" "Not directly. She was careful about that." Mrs. Davenport pushed herself up from her chair. "But she did leave something behind. Wait here." They watched as she disappeared down a short hallway, returning moments later with a battered tin box, the kind that once held Christmas cookies, its surface now scratched and dented. She handed it to Jagger with reverence. His hands were steady as he lifted the lid, but his breath caught at the contents. A detailed map of the surrounding wilderness, with one location circled in red. Several pages of handwritten notes in what appeared to be some kind of personal code. And there, tucked in the corner, a Polaroid photo that couldn't be more than a month old. Emily's face looked thinner than he remembered, her eyes wider, but she was unmistakably alive. She stood in front of this very fireplace, arms wrapped around herself, trying to smile, but fear evident in every line of her body. "She took that the day before she left," Mrs. Davenport said softly. "Said she wanted me to have a recent picture in case—" She didn't finish the sentence. Grace moved closer, peering at the map. "That marked location. It must be a supply cache. Emily was always thorough about planning escape routes." "She mentioned Grace often," Mrs. Davenport said suddenly, causing both of them to look up. "Said if anything happened to her, Grace was the only one she trusted to help make things right. Said Grace had a good heart, even if she'd made mistakes." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She sank back onto the sofa, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I should have done more," she whispered. I knew something wasn't right with those trial results, but I was too scared to speak up. Emily was braver than me, and now she's out there somewhere, alone, because I waited too long to help." Mrs. Davenport crossed to sit beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're helping now, dear. That's what matters." "We should eat," the older woman announced after a moment, rising with purpose. "Can't think straight on empty stomachs." She wouldn't take no for an answer, bustling into her small kitchen to heat up homemade vegetable soup and slice fresh bread. The simple meal felt like a lifeline to normalcy, even as they spread the map across the coffee table between bites, studying possible routes and scenarios. "The supply drop is here," Jagger traced the marked location with his finger. "About 15 miles northeast, deep in the National Forest. But these notes..." He frowned at the coded pages. "We need to crack them before we move. Could be crucial information." "I recognize some of this." Grace leaned closer. "It's based on a game we used to play during lunch breaks, taking turns adding new rules to make it harder. Emily and I were the only ones who could keep up with all the variations." She pulled a notepad from her bag and began working on the cipher. The hours crept past midnight. Mrs. Davenport made coffee, then tea, refusing to retire despite their protests that she should rest. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I'll take first watch," Jagger finally said, moving to the window seat with clear views of the approach to the cabin. "Both of you should try to sleep. Tomorrow will be long." Grace curled up on the sofa, still clutching her notepad. Mrs. Davenport reluctantly retreated to her bedroom, leaving her door open to hear if she was needed. Jagger settled in for his vigil, one hand resting near the weapon concealed under his jacket. The mountain night pressed against the windows, thick and dark. Somewhere out there, Emily was hiding, running, surviving. He would find her. He had to. The hours crept past like molasses. He watched the moon track across the sky, listened to the night birds call, stayed alert for any sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the forest. Just before dawn, when the sky was still ink black but starting to soften around the edges, he saw them. Headlights far down the mountain, moving with unnatural slowness, searching, hunting. His hand tightened on his gun as he watched the lights weave through the trees. Their deliberate pace made his skin crawl. They were looking for something, or someone, and they were getting closer. The morning frost etched delicate patterns across the cabin windows, catching the first pale rays of dawn. Jagger stood rigid by the window, his shoulders tense as he briefed Grace and Mrs. Davenport about what he'd witnessed in the pre-dawn hours. "The vehicle moved like it was searching," he explained, his voice low and controlled. "Slow, methodical. Not the way tourists or locals drive these roads." Grace hugged herself, her face drawn with worry. "They must have tracked us somehow. We need to move." Mrs. Davenport was already in motion, gathering supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd lived through mountain winters. She packed dried food, matches, and first aid supplies into 3 weathered backpacks. "Take these," she insisted, pressing warm thermoses of coffee into their hands. "And these too." She added thick wool scarves to their collection. They spread Emily's map across the kitchen table one last time. The marked location was deep in the National Forest, at least 4 miles from the nearest road. Jagger traced the route with his finger, memorizing the landmarks. "We should stick to the deer trails," Mrs. Davenport advised. "Less likely to leave obvious tracks." The morning air bit at their faces as they slipped out the back door. Frost crunched under their boots as they made their way into the dense forest. Pine needles overhead filtered the weak sunlight, creating shifting patterns on the snow-dusted ground. Grace proved surprisingly adept at moving quietly, placing her feet carefully to avoid breaking branches. Mrs. Davenport, despite her age, navigated the rough terrain with the sure-footedness of someone who'd walked these paths for decades. They walked for nearly 2 hours, following a narrow trail that wound between towering pines. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional cry of a hawk and their own measured breathing. "There," Jagger whispered finally, pointing to a fallen log ahead. It was massive, its core hollowed by age and weather, exactly matching the location marked on Emily's map. He approached cautiously, checking for signs of disturbance. The log's opening was cleverly concealed by a growth of moss, but when he brushed it aside, he found what they were looking for. A waterproof bag had been wedged deep inside. Jagger pulled it out carefully, his hands steady despite the emotion building in his chest. Inside were canned food, bottles of water, and a small first aid kit, basic survival supplies, carefully chosen. But it was the log itself that held the most precious find. As Jagger shone his flashlight deeper into the hollow, Grace gasped. There, scratched into the inside of the lid with what must have been a knife, was a message. "If Jagger comes, tell him I'm trying to live." The words hit him like a physical blow. His sister's voice seemed to echo in those simple words, her determination, her fear, her hope that he would come. For the first time since receiving the warning about Emily's danger, Jagger's careful control cracked. He turned away abruptly, taking several steps into the trees. His shoulders shook once, then again. Grace started to follow, but Mrs. Davenport caught her arm gently. "Give him a moment, dear," she murmured. "Some feelings need privacy to be felt." They busied themselves repacking the supplies, pretending not to notice when Jagger rejoined them several minutes later, his eyes suspiciously red, but his voice steady. The sun had climbed higher as they continued another mile through the forest. The terrain grew rougher, with rocky outcroppings breaking through the soil. Finally, they spotted the small well house Emily had marked as the second location. It was a simple stone structure, probably built in the 1930s when the ranger station was still active. The door creaked as Jagger eased it open, revealing a deep well shaft and dusty shelves. "Look." Grace pointed to a loose stone in the wall. When Jagger pried it free, a small package wrapped in oilcloth fell into his palm. Inside was an old silver locket, its surface tarnished but still beautiful. When he opened it, they found half of a torn photograph, Emily's smiling face, but torn diagonally across, separating her from whoever had stood beside her in the original picture. "She's leaving us a trail," Grace said softly. "But why tear the photo?" "Maybe the other half leads somewhere else," Mrs. Davenport suggested. "Or maybe she's telling us something about who she's running from." The sun was already sliding toward the horizon, the temperature dropping rapidly with the approach of evening. They found the abandoned ranger shed exactly where Mrs. Davenport remembered it, half hidden in a grove of aspens. The inside was dusty but solid, with a small pot-bellied stove and sturdy walls that would block the worst of the wind. They cleared away years of leaves and debris, setting up a makeshift camp in the single room. Mrs. Davenport got a small fire going in the stove, while Grace arranged their sleeping bags in a circle around its warmth. Jagger took up position by the window, watching the deepening shadows between the trees. The wind picked up as night fell, whistling through the bare aspen branches. But underneath that natural sound, another noise made them all freeze. The low, distant rumble of engines, moving somewhere in the darkness of the forest. They exchanged tense glances, knowing that somewhere out there, other people were searching these woods. People who might not want Emily's secrets found. Dawn crept into the ranger's shed through frost-covered windows, painting pale squares on the wooden floor. The small pot-bellied stove had gone cold hours ago, leaving the three occupants shivering in their sleeping bags despite huddling close together for warmth. Jagger woke first, his breath visible in the frigid morning air. His muscles ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but his mind was sharp with purpose. The engine sounds they'd heard last night had faded away, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Morning," Grace whispered, her voice rough with sleep. She sat up, wrapping her jacket tighter around herself. "I don't think I've been this cold since I was a kid camping in the Rockies." Mrs. Davenport stirred next, her weathered face creasing into a gentle smile despite their circumstances. "Nothing wakes you up quite like mountain morning air," she said, though her teeth chattered slightly. They shared a meager breakfast of granola bars and dried fruit from Emily's cached supplies, washing it down with water that was nearly ice cold. No one complained. They all understood the gravity of their situation too well for such petty concerns. "Emily sent me a message from up there," Grace said, pointing through the window toward a rocky overlook visible above the tree line. "It was from a burner phone, just once. She said the view helped her think clearly." Jagger studied the steep path leading up. "How long ago?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. She was moving around a lot by then, trying to stay ahead of them." Grace's voice caught slightly on the last word, and she busied herself with repacking her bag. They set out as soon as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, moving carefully through the underbrush. Mrs. Davenport insisted on coming despite her age, showing remarkable stamina as they climbed the increasingly rough terrain. The trail switched back and forth across the face of the cliff, forcing them to walk single file. Loose rocks skittered under their feet, dropping away into the forest below. After nearly an hour of steady climbing, they reached the overlook. The view was breathtaking. Miles of wilderness stretched out before them, the morning sun catching on distant peaks still capped with snow. But Jagger wasn't interested in the scenery. His eyes scanned the ground, looking for signs of his sister's passage. "Here," Mrs. Davenport called out, her keen eyes spotting what they'd missed. A set of partial footprints led away from the main outcropping, heading toward a narrow crevice in the rock face. Jagger approached carefully, aware of the drop-off just feet away. The crevice was barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look, and wedged inside was a small metal container, the kind hikers use to store matches. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, unfolding a piece of paper, protected from the elements. Emily's hurried handwriting covered the page. "They found my first camp, heading South Ridge. Don't follow unless it's Jay." Grace read the note over his shoulder, her breath catching. "She knew you'd come," she said softly. "Just like I told you she did." Jagger looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing past his initial distrust to the genuine concern in her eyes. "She trusted you too," he acknowledged, "enough to put your life at risk protecting her identity." A moment of understanding passed between them. Two people united by their love for Emily, despite their differences. Mrs. Davenport watched them with quiet approval, but the peaceful moment was shattered by the crack of a branch breaking nearby. They turned to see two men emerging from the tree line, wearing tactical gear and carrying automatic weapons. The corporate mercenaries had found them. "Run!" Jagger shouted, shoving Grace toward the descending trail while positioning himself between the armed men and Mrs. Davenport. What followed was chaos. They scrambled down the rocky path, loose stones cascading beneath their feet. The mercenaries pursued with practiced efficiency, splitting up to cut off their escape routes. Grace stumbled on a root, catching herself just before falling. Jagger grabbed her arm, pulling her up and forward, but the delay cost them precious seconds. Mrs. Davenport had managed to duck behind a large boulder, but they could hear the mercenaries closing in. "This way!" Grace gasped, spotting a deer trail through dense brush. They crashed through the vegetation, branches whipping at their faces. A shape lunged from behind a tree, One of the mercenaries had circled around. His arm locked around Grace's waist, yanking her backward with brutal force. She screamed, kicking and fighting against his grip. Jagger spun back, his face contorted with rage. He launched himself at the mercenary, his fist connecting with the man's jaw. But before he could press his advantage, the second mercenary arrived. The fight was brief and violent. Jagger managed to land several solid hits, his years of hard living evident in the way he fought. But he was outnumbered, and these men were professionals. The blow came from behind, a rifle butt to the base of his skull. Jagger's world exploded in pain and bright lights. He fell hard, tasting blood and dirt as his face hit the forest floor. Through dimming vision, he saw Grace being dragged toward a black SUV that had somehow made it up a logging road. Her voice seemed to come from very far away as she screamed his name, struggling against her captors. "Jagger! Jagger!" The last thing he felt was blood trickling down his neck, and then darkness claimed him completely. Pain throbbed through Jagger's skull as consciousness slowly returned. The world swam in and out of focus, trees and sky blending together in a nauseating swirl. He tried to move, but his body felt like lead, every muscle screaming in protest. "Easy now, son," a gentle voice said. "You took quite a blow to the head." Mrs. Davenport's weathered face came into view as she knelt beside him, her kind eyes filled with worry. She pressed a cool cloth against the wound at the base of his skull, making him wince. "Grace," he croaked, his throat dry and raw. "They took Grace." "I know," Mrs. Davenport said softly. "I followed when I heard the shouting, stayed hidden in the trees, but I saw everything. Those men were professionals. Military trained, I'd guess." Jagger struggled to sit up, fighting against waves of dizziness. His clothes were torn and caked with dirt and blood. The forest had grown dim around them. He'd been unconscious for hours. Every second wasted was another second Grace was in danger. "We have to move," he growled, using a nearby tree to pull himself upright. The world tilted alarmingly, but Mrs. Davenport was there, letting him lean on her surprisingly strong frame until he found his balance. "There," she pointed to clear tire tracks cutting through the underbrush. "They had a vehicle waiting on the old utility road. Not many know about it. It was used to service the power lines years ago." Together they followed the tracks, moving as quickly as Jagger's battered body would allow. The utility road was overgrown, but still visible, winding away through the trees. "My truck's not far," Mrs. Davenport said. "We need to get you back to the cabin and tend those wounds properly." Jagger wanted to argue, to insist on following the tracks immediately, but he could barely walk straight. He knew she was right. He'd be no help to Grace or Emily in this condition. The drive back to the cabin seemed endless. Every bump in the road sent fresh spikes of pain through Jagger's head. Mrs. Davenport kept glancing at him with motherly concern, but she didn't coddle him with empty reassurances. Inside the cabin, she sat him at the kitchen table and went to work. Her movements were efficient as she cleaned and bandaged his wounds, particularly the nasty gash where the rifle butt had struck him. "Drink this," she ordered, placing a mug of steaming broth in front of him. "You need your strength." As Jagger sipped the warm liquid, Mrs. Davenport settled into a chair across from him. Her face was grave in the lamplight. "Emily told me about these people," she said quietly. "About what she discovered at that company. They were falsifying drug trial results, hiding severe side effects. People died, young people, children even. When Emily tried to expose it, they came after her hard." Jagger's hands tightened around the mug. "And now they have Grace too." "That poor girl," Mrs. Davenport shook her head. "She gave up everything to help Emily. Her job, her home, her safety. Said she couldn't live with herself if she stayed quiet." The weight of failure pressed down on Jagger's shoulders, threatening to crush him. He'd promised to protect Emily, had come all this way to save her, and instead, he'd let another innocent person be taken. Hours passed. Mrs. Davenport tried to stay awake with him, but eventually dozed off in her rocking chair, a quilt pulled around her shoulders. The cabin grew quiet except for the soft crackle of dying embers in the fireplace. Jagger stepped outside, needing air. The night was crystal clear, countless stars scattered across the black sky like diamond dust. The cold mountain air bit at his skin, but he welcomed the sharp clarity it brought to his thoughts. For the first time since he was a child, Jagger felt the overwhelming urge to pray. He'd turned his back on faith years ago, when he'd chosen the outlaw life. But now, standing alone under the vast starlit sky, words began to spill from his lips. "I know I haven't talked to you in a long time," he whispered roughly. "Haven't deserved to. But Emily, she's innocent in all this. And Grace, she was just trying to do the right thing. Please, I need help. I need guidance. I can't fail them again." Movement caught his eye, a rhythmic blinking in the distance. At first he thought it was a star, but the pattern was too regular. Stepping away from the cabin for a better view, Jagger realized what he was seeing. Warning lights on top of a large building, barely visible through the trees. His breath caught as understanding dawned. There was a research facility hidden in these mountains, one he'd never known about, one that might hold the answers he desperately needed. The red lights continued their steady pulse against the night sky, like a beacon calling him forward, calling him to Emily. The pale light of pre-dawn found Jagger moving quietly through Mrs. Davenport's cabin, gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. His body still ached from yesterday's beating, but determination pushed the pain aside. He filled a small backpack with water, protein bars, and basic first aid supplies. In the kitchen drawer, he found a roll of duct tape and added it to his pack. You never knew when that might come in handy. His hand paused over the notepad by the phone. Mrs. Davenport deserved more than just disappearing, so he quickly scrawled, "Gone to get them both back. I promise to return. Thank you for everything. Jay." The morning air bit through his jacket as he stepped outside. The facility's warning lights were no longer visible in the growing dawn, but he'd memorized their location. Keeping the rising sun to his left, Jagger set out through the woods, moving as quietly as his old biker days had taught him. The terrain grew steeper as he climbed, forcing him to navigate countless switchbacks. His boots found purchase on loose rocks and fallen pine needles, each step carefully placed to avoid making noise. Years of running from law enforcement had taught him how to move like a shadow, and those skills were serving him well now. After 2 hours of steady climbing, Jagger caught his first clear glimpse of the facility through the trees. It was smaller than he'd expected, a cluster of modern buildings surrounded by a high security fence. The main structure looked like a typical office building, but several metal-sided outbuildings suggested more industrial purposes. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter at regular intervals. Jagger dropped to his stomach and spent 30 minutes watching the guard rotations. 2 men walking opposite directions, meeting every 8 minutes on the far side. That gave him a 7-minute window on the near side. His eyes scanned the fence line until he spotted what he needed, a large drainage culvert passing under the fence. Perfect. When the guards moved away, Jagger sprinted to the culvert. The entrance was partially blocked by a metal grate, but years of rust had weakened its moorings. With careful pressure, he worked it loose enough to squeeze through. The pipe was wide enough to crawl through, though the damp concrete scraped his elbows and knees. Emerging on the inside of the fence, Jagger pressed himself against the shadow of the nearest building. His heart pounded as footsteps approached, but the guard passed without looking his way. Moving in short bursts between buildings, Jagger worked his way deeper into the facility. A sound stopped him cold, a voice he recognized. Grace. She was speaking, her words strained and hoarse like she'd been talking or screaming for hours. "Please," she was saying, "I've told you everything I know. Emily never shared her exact location with me. That was the point, to keep her safe." Jagger crept toward the voice, which was coming from one of the metal-sided buildings. Through a dirty window, he could see Grace tied to a chair. Her face was pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept. A man in a dark suit paced in front of her while a guard stood by the door, rifle held casually but ready. "Ms. Whitaker," the suit said, "we know you were in contact with her. The phone records prove it. Now we can do this the easy way, or we can make things very uncomfortable for you." Grace lifted her chin, showing a flash of defiance despite her fear. "Do whatever you want. I won't help you hurt her." The suit sighed and nodded to the guard. As the armed man stepped forward, Jagger assessed his options. The building had a side door, probably for maintenance access. If he timed it right. Jagger waited until the suit turned away, then slipped to the side door. It was locked, but the hinges were on his side. Working quickly and silently, he used his pocket knife to pop the pins free. The door sagged slightly in its frame. The guard was focused on Grace, his back to the door. Jagger eased the door open just enough to squeeze through. In 3 swift steps, he crossed the room and wrapped his arm around the guard's throat in a chokehold. The man struggled, but Jagger held firm until he went limp. He lowered the unconscious guard quietly to the floor. Grace's eyes were wide with shock and relief as Jagger quickly untied her bonds. As soon as she was free, she practically fell against him, her fingers clutching his jacket like she was afraid he might disappear. "You came," she whispered. "I didn't know if—" "Of course I came," Jagger said gruffly, supporting her weight as she found her balance. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though she kept one hand on his arm. "We have to hurry. The suit will be back any minute. He just stepped out to take a call." Jagger led her toward the door, but Grace pulled back. Her face was tight with urgency as she grabbed his sleeve. "Wait," she choked out, her voice raw with emotion. "They have Emily in the basement wing." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. They couldn't leave, not without his sister. But Grace's revelation had another effect. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jagger knew with absolute certainty that Emily was alive, and she was close. Now he just had to figure out how to get them all out of here alive. Jagger pulled Grace close to the wall as footsteps echoed down the hallway. His heart hammered against his ribs as they pressed themselves behind a large equipment cart. The harsh fluorescent lights made hiding difficult, but the industrial clutter of the facility worked in their favor. "Which way to the basement?" he whispered. Grace pointed toward a set of heavy metal doors at the end of the corridor. "There's a stairwell, but we need a keycard to—" A shrill alarm cut through the air, making them both jump. Red emergency lights began flashing along the walls as a computerized voice announced, "Security breach in Section C. All personnel report to designated stations." "They found the guard," Jagger muttered. "We need to move. Now." They darted between shadows, using rolling carts and tall cabinets as cover. The alarm continued its piercing wail as doors began slamming in the distance. Voices called out, growing closer with each passing second. When they reached the stairwell doors, Grace grabbed a keycard from her pocket, lifted from one of her interrogators during the confusion. The lock clicked open, and they slipped inside just as a group of guards rushed past in the main hallway. The stairwell was dim and concrete, their footsteps echoing despite their attempts at stealth. 2 flights down, The air grew cooler and damper. The basement level stretched out before them, filled with storage rooms and what looked like research facilities. A faint sound caught Jagger's attention. Someone coughing. The weak, painful sound came from one of the isolation rooms at the far end of the hall. His chest tightened as he recognized the particular way the cough caught and cleared, just like when Emily had pneumonia as a kid. "There," he breathed, pointing to the room. They approached cautiously, aware that every second increased their risk of discovery. Through the small window in the door, Jagger could make out a figure huddled on a narrow cot. His sister was curled on her side, her dark hair hanging limp around her face. She looked smaller than he remembered, her frame too thin, her skin pale under harsh fluorescent lights. Grace's hands shook as she swiped the keycard. The lock disengaged with a soft click that seemed too loud in the tense silence. Jagger eased the door open, his heart in his throat. Emily's head snapped up at the sound, fear flashing across her face before recognition dawned. "Jagger?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse or illness. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her into his arms. She felt fragile, bird-boned, but her grip was strong as she clung to him. Tears soaked into his shirt as Emily sobbed quietly against his chest. "I knew you'd come," she choked out. "I knew you'd find me." Jagger pressed his face into her hair, his own eyes burning. "I'm sorry it took so long, Em. I'm so sorry." At the door, Grace watched their reunion with tears streaming down her cheeks. Months of lying, hiding, and risking everything had led to this moment. When Emily looked up and saw her, she reached out one trembling hand. "Grace," Emily said, "you did it! You got him here!" Grace rushed forward to embrace them both. "I promised I would. I promised I'd keep you safe." The moment was broken by the sound of boots on the stairs above them. Jagger pulled back, instantly alert. "We need to move. Can you walk, Em?" Emily nodded, though she swayed slightly as she stood. Jagger kept one arm around her waist while Grace gathered the few personal items Emily had managed to keep. A small notebook, a worn photo, a silver chain with their mother's ring. They made their way back through the basement as quickly as Emily's weakness would allow. Instead of returning to the stairs, Grace led them toward a service elevator at the opposite end. "The loading bay is on the ground floor," she explained. "There's always vehicles there. It's our best chance." The elevator seemed agonizingly slow, each floor bringing them closer to discovery. When the doors finally opened, they found themselves in a large warehouse space filled with crates and parked vehicles. The main bay doors were closed, but a smaller personnel door stood open to the night air. They had almost reached it when a shout rang out, "Stop right there!" 3 mercenaries emerged from behind a stack of crates, weapons raised. Jagger pushed Emily behind him as more armed men appeared, blocking their escape route. "It's over," one of them said, stepping forward. "Nobody else needs to get hurt here." Jagger's eyes darted around the space, calculating odds and angles. He could see Grace doing the same, her gaze fixed on a service truck parked nearby. With the smallest nod, she acknowledged his unspoken plan. "You're right," Jagger said, raising his hands. "It's over." Then he exploded into motion, tackling the nearest guard while Grace sprinted for the truck. Emily pressed herself against a concrete pillar as chaos erupted in the loading bay. Jagger fought with desperate intensity, using every dirty trick he'd learned in his outlaw years. He slammed one attacker's head against a crate, ducked under another's wild swing to drive his knee into vulnerable ribs. A punch caught him in the jaw, making his vision blur, but he pushed through the pain. The sound of an engine roaring to life cut through the melee. Grace had the truck running, her face fierce with concentration as she yanked wires together under the steering wheel. She threw the vehicle into reverse, crashing through a stack of empty pallets to create chaos and cover. Jagger took advantage of the distraction to break free from the fight. He grabbed Emily and half-carried her to the truck as bullets began to ping off metal and concrete around them. Grace was already moving before they fully closed the doors, tires squealing as she accelerated toward the exit. More shots rang out behind them, the back window spiderwebbing with impact. Emily huddled against Jagger's chest in the back seat, while Grace focused on getting them clear of the facility. The truck's tailgate shuddered with repeated strikes, but they were pulling away, picking up speed as they hit the access road. Grace took a hard turn onto a Forest Service road, the truck bouncing over ruts and rocks as they fled into the darkness. The sound of gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the rumble of the engine and their own ragged breathing. They had done it. They had Emily back. Now they just had to survive the night. The truck rumbled down winding mountain roads, headlights cutting through pre-dawn darkness. Grace kept her hands tight on the wheel, taking each turn with careful precision despite her exhaustion. In the back seat, Emily dozed fitfully against Jagger's shoulder, her breathing shallow but steady. They stuck to unpaved Forest Service routes and forgotten back roads, avoiding any chance of being followed. The sky was just beginning to lighten when Mrs. Davenport's cabin finally came into view, smoke already rising from the chimney. The elderly widow burst through her front door before they could even get out of the truck. "Bring her inside, quickly now," she called, already holding blankets. Jagger lifted Emily as carefully as if she were made of glass. She felt too light in his arms, weeks of captivity evident in her frail frame. Mrs. Davenport directed him to lay Emily on the couch closest to the fireplace, immediately wrapping her in warm quilts. "I'll heat up some chicken broth," Mrs. Davenport said, her usual calm demeanor tinged with maternal worry. "She needs something gentle on her stomach." Grace made it as far as the armchair before her legs gave out. She sank down, her face pale with exhaustion, hands still shaking from the night's events. The weight of months spent maintaining her cover, of constantly looking over her shoulder, seemed to crash down all at once. Jagger stood in the middle of the room, suddenly unsure what to do with himself now that the immediate danger had passed. His muscles trembled with spent adrenaline, and the various bruises from the fight were making themselves known. After so many years of running, of fighting, of destroying, the simple act of being still felt foreign. He finally allowed himself to sink onto the edge of the hearth, watching the flames dance as morning light began filtering through the windows. Mrs. Davenport moved quietly around them, bringing Emily sips of warm broth, checking Grace's scrapes from the escape, pressing a cup of hot coffee into Jagger's hands. The knock at the door made them all freeze, but instead of mercenaries, 2 federal agents stood on the porch, badges held up for inspection. "We received an anonymous tip," the female agent said, her voice professional but kind, "along with quite a bit of evidence about corporate wrongdoing." Grace raised her head wearily. "I sent everything I had gathered. All the proof of the falsified trials, the cover-ups, the threats. I couldn't risk sending it earlier without compromising Emily's safety." The agents came inside, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. The male agent crouched next to Emily, his stern expression softening. "Ms. Holt, we're here to help. We can offer you full protection while you recover and prepare your testimony." "And you, Ms. Whitaker?" the female agent addressed Grace. "Given your assistance in exposing this conspiracy and helping protect a key witness, we're prepared to offer you immunity in exchange for your own testimony about your time inside the corporation." Emily's hand found Jagger's, squeezing weakly. "Will my brother be able to stay? Just while you take my statement?" The agents exchanged a look, then nodded. "We can arrange that," the female agent said, "given the circumstances. The rest of the day passed in a blur of questions, statements, and medical checks from a bureau doctor. Mrs. Davenport kept everyone supplied with coffee and her homemade bread, a steady presence amidst the activity. Grace spoke for hours with the agents, providing details about the corporation's internal workings that helped fill in the gaps in their case. As evening settled over the mountains, the agents finally departed, leaving behind emergency contact numbers and promises to return in the morning. Emily had fallen into an exhausted sleep. Grace was dozing in the armchair, and Mrs. Davenport had retired to her bedroom after making sure everyone was settled. Jagger stepped out onto the porch, letting the cool mountain air clear his head. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, peaceful in a way that seemed almost unreal after everything they'd been through. He leaned against the railing, thinking about choices and consequences. For the first time in years, his hands had been used to protect rather than harm, to save rather than destroy. The realization settled over him like a physical weight, both heavy with responsibility and somehow freeing. Tonight, his sister was safe. Grace was free from her burden of deception, and maybe, just maybe, he had taken the first step toward his own redemption. The mountain air carried the fresh scent of melting snow and early spring buds. Emily, Grace, and Jagger walked slowly along the worn trail behind Mrs. Davenport's cabin, their footsteps crunching on patches of lingering frost. After a week of federal debriefings and preparations, this quiet morning felt like a gift. "Remember when we used to hike these trails as kids?" Emily asked, her voice stronger now, though still carrying echoes of her ordeal. She paused to touch a budding aspen tree. "You always led the way, Jagger." Jagger nodded, watching his sister carefully. Though still thin, color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes held their old sparkle. "You were fearless back then. Still are." Grace walked beside them, her shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. The official clearance of wrongdoing had lifted a massive weight from her spirit. "Your brother saved both of us," she said softly to Emily. Emily smiled, a knowing look crossing her face. "You saved each other. I always knew you would." She reached out to touch both their arms. "That's why I trusted you with my life, Grace, and why I knew Jagger would come when you needed him most." They reached a small clearing where wildflowers were just beginning to peek through the earth. Emily turned to face them both. "I want you to stay connected after I go. You both deserve happiness after everything you've sacrificed." Grace looked at Jagger, vulnerability clear in her eyes. "I've been thinking about starting fresh somewhere quiet and safe." She took a deep breath. Maybe we could try building that new life together, if you want to." Jagger's hand found hers, rough fingers gentle against her palm. "I'm done running," he said. "Think it's time to learn how to stay put, to build something good." Later, they stood in Mrs. Davenport's driveway as federal agents loaded Emily's bags into a black SUV. The Witness Protection Program would give her a new name, a new city, a chance to rebuild. Emily hugged them both tightly, whispering words of love and hope. As the vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, Jagger and Grace remained hand in hand, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon light. Without words, they turned back toward the cabin, toward Mrs. Davenport's waiting smile and fresh-baked bread, toward a future neither had dared imagine just weeks ago, one built on redemption, renewed faith, and the unexpected gift of family found in the midst of crisis. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.